Yes, so I'm very happy to be here. I'm also a bit puzzled, in a sense, because when walking here, towards this lecture room, Victor told me that he was not sure whether there would be many people, but this is really a lot of people here. So I'm very pleased that so many people have turned up to listen to this lecture. So I teach in Utrecht. I teach international business and entrepreneurship in Utrecht, but I think that the connection with Tomsk is also that I chair the combined centers for entrepreneurship of the universities and the polytechnics in the Netherlands, which are 23. And over the last 6-7 years, we have built up in nearly all universities and polytechnics these centers for entrepreneurship. And that is a process in which I've been heavily engaged. And I think we met also with Tomsk, and this is a bit like a week where I want to share some of these insights, although I'm very well aware that where I come from is very different, but that's actually the case for all universities. So to give also a good advice, I need a bit of work also with you to see what are the specifics about that. So my talk is that I will start, and I think for a bit like 45 minutes about my topic of entrepreneurial ecosystems. To come back to that next, and then I would also like your input for 45 minutes in a discussion of what you think is important about the things that I've touched upon in this lecture, because I think for everybody it's important that we share this type of information here. So this is a bit of my broad setup. To manage expectations of the lecture also a bit, is that I was actually, the first connection was that 2 months ago there was a conference here at Tomsk University where I was also invited, and then there I talked about entrepreneurship education. Now I don't want to lecture this twice, so but although many of you were not there, so this is not per se about entrepreneurship education, this lecture. So I will say some words about it, but the lecture is about this building of entrepreneurial ecosystem. So a bit more of how you organize around universities, the ecosystem, and how you deal with that. Of course, I will say a few things about what I think is optimal entrepreneurship education, but I would like to stress that that is not the topic of my talk today. So why is this important? So first observation is that I think the world is changing a bit. I always give the, if you ask what entrepreneurs are, in many countries the word entrepreneur has, let's say, a strange name, as somebody who has become a billionaire, but people are a trader. But if you think about the modern entrepreneur, then yes, Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard. Bill Gates didn't finish a university education. But these two, Steve Jobs, the same. But if you think about Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, they had something in common. They both won in Harvard. MIT, well, in Princeton, had the main science prize in their first year. So if you think about the entrepreneurs that we know today, they are not the big traders that we might see from China and India. Many of the very successful entrepreneurs have a science background. And more, these type of capabilities are needed also to become a great entrepreneur. But obviously, if you look at your university, it doesn't come natural with people coming from university from a science background to have this type of entrepreneurship. These people dropped out mostly of university because they found out during university that they are great entrepreneurs. And what we see now is that many new entrepreneurs actually do have high levels of university education, including PhDs. Just another example that I would like to give you about entrepreneurship. One of the most successful entrepreneurship programs is in Harvard University. But I would like to share with you how they started that entrepreneurship center and entrepreneurship program. Is that Harvard traditionally was in management and innovation. So they were teaching people the tools to work in large companies and to become CEOs. But then they conducted, some 15 years ago, a survey among their alumni about their work environment. And it turned out that more than 50% of their alumni that they had trained to become managers and CEOs in large firms actually started their own company. Not immediately after their study, but in the 10 days after it. And that changed the thinking in many universities, MIT, Harvard, to say, look, if we talk about this type of business, we should not do management, or think we should do more about entrepreneurship, because we know that so many people will actually end up in these type of environments. So yes, it starts also that not all scientists are entrepreneurs, whereas many of them end up in an environment where they have to. Well, what is a second observation is that, and that's also a bit of the connection to the lecture, is that you can talk a lot what is an entrepreneur as an individual. What kind of skills are we born, or can you teach entrepreneurship? These are all very relevant questions, but to become an entrepreneur or a successful entrepreneur, you have to be it yourself, but what is probably equally or even more important is that the environment around you provides you with the tools and opportunities to become an entrepreneur. And if you think about policies or what universities can do, they cannot make you an individual entrepreneur. Not that easy. But what they can do is organize or contribute to an environment that supports the people who want to be entrepreneurial. And if you talk about things like centers for entrepreneurship, that's quite important to provide opportunities for people who want to be there and not to create the type of people to be so. So that's an important type of insight, I think, as well. Now, the last thing is that we tend to think about people like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, but they are actually quite exceptional cases. Most of the cases that we know of successful entrepreneurship is teams of people that start firms. So instead of focusing also on the ideas, what is very important is that people learn to collaborate in an entrepreneurial environment. And often what helps there as well is as these people come from a more diverse background, to have differences in skills, differences in experiences. And in a university setting, it is often quite hard to connect to people with different skills to form these. So how do you create this type of opportunities for diversity within the university system for people to make effective teams? Also very important, because most firms, but nearly all modern firms, are started by teams and not by individuals. Okay, so I think that my last point of this slide is that if you connect entrepreneurship to, let's say, more economics or international economics, then you must have some kind of an idea of that most of the value in the economy is created by exchange and not only by production. So the basic idea, of course, of the modern economics is that you do something which other people value, you specialize in that, but the value is created through the exchange between people, or the exchange of firms, but essentially among economic actors. So the idea, of course, in a region is that entrepreneurship often means that you organize things which you can sell in a very broad or even global context. So it is also to create some kind of an idea of what specific value-added activities for others you can actually do. So it is also sometimes that these organizations and the universities are places that are the first international connectors. Maybe also for me, if you think about my work, I work a lot with the ambassador, I work a lot for Dutch firms. Often if they come to another place, the first thing they look is not a company. Because if they look for other companies to visit, they immediately have to do business. They don't want to do. If Philips comes here, they don't come for another company. They first come to a university and see what kind of a knowledge there is. But that means that a university must have access points for that type of exchange. And that you see more and more, that universities play a very important role in facilitating this type of international exchange. Okay, so this is a bit of a very philosophical motivation well, my job, essentially, most of the times. Okay, what I would like you to do is to share a bit, and I'm not going to make all kinds of references to theory, but I'm going to show you a slide about what we know is important in an entrepreneurial ecosystem. But before I show you this slide, I want to keep you in mind is that my talk of the next two slides is more about cooking, in a sense. And it's a bit of a metaphor. If you want to do good cooking, you need two things, probably more things, but at least two things, is that you need the right ingredients, but you also need a good recipe. And what I think goes wrong in the building of many entrepreneurial ecosystems or the efforts is that people think in cooking that if you have the right ingredients, you have a nice meal. Not only that, you also need good cooks and a good recipe. So let me first look at what are the ingredients that you need to surround students with a good entrepreneurial ecosystem. What do we know? Well, this is a bit of a landscape. And on the left, there are, I would call, three starting elements that should be there. So first of all, you need people with talent. So not all regions have people with talent, but many have. If you have talented people like students, other young people, but it can also be older people, of course, which have done different things in life. Many entrepreneurs start when they are 50 after a successful career. But you need to have people with certain talent. Talent, however, for entrepreneurship is probably not enough. You also need to have nice ideas to do something with your talent. And then the last thing, funding. Of course, there are large areas in Africa where you have very talented people who have great ideas, but they have no money at all to start these ideas. So don't underestimate those. So these kind of three things. So what we can do, of course, is to later assess for an environment what are the, let's say, the shortages that you have. Most of the times, and that's basically my argument, none of these three, to my assessment so far, is a big problem in Tomsk. Because we're not talking about funding to make huge firms, we talk about funding to start. We talk about talent, and enough ideas. So this is not a problem, and these foundations are often there. Now, if we talk about the ecosystem itself, then there it becomes a bit more tight. Because all these ingredients are important for an ecosystem, but there are often quite a bit of weaknesses. And if you do, like in social science, network studies, you talk about these kind of structural holes. So you can have 3 or 4 out of 4, but if you miss one, the other 3 cannot connect. So you need, like in an engine, probably all elements for the car to run, or it won't run at all. So you cannot have, so you need to have them all in the good quality to actually make entrepreneurship run. And I think there are 4 elements of these ecosystems which are very important. So I start, let's say, at the bottom, because again, funding of ideas is important. Now there are, I think, a few misunderstandings with respect to funding in general in the ecosystem. We tend to think about venture capital, etc., etc. But don't underestimate that might have been important 20 years ago, but don't underestimate simply what banks can do as well. Small loans, what the Sperbank, Gazprombank do to start up small ideas, these things are also quite important and give you simple loans to start to make you have a revenue. But often this is a problem. Banks are not allowed to invest. They can only give loans and you need to have a track record. So how willing are banks to supply these kind of funds for larger? Now another source of funding might be, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but lots of funding in an entrepreneurial ecosystem comes from successful entrepreneurs themselves. So you create often a bit of a chicken and egg system that if you don't have entrepreneurs who have grown, you don't have the funding for new entrepreneurs because that often comes from so-called angels. So it takes time for a few successful people to give back to community in terms of funding. So that is, but in general, this type of funding structures for entrepreneurship are quite important. If you move to human capital, universities for this talent and ideas are very important. So you need to have structures that support this kind of entrepreneurship. But there, and we will talk about Centers for Entrepreneurship more, of course, it is important that the university also sees a role for himself to create situations in which they manage people to enter, their students to enter this type of entrepreneurial ecosystem. So to be part of that ecosystem as an entrepreneurial university. To the right is that lots of funding of ideas comes from so-called launching customers. So just to give you a short how important this can be, a year ago we exchanged information with the Russian central government about innovation strategies and entrepreneurial strategies. And the year before I presented the plan how we did this in the Netherlands. So how we did this. And then we basically in our policy had 3 pillars. We focused in the Netherlands on a few top sectors, most important industries. Then we had a valorization, so a policy for universities to become more engaged in innovation for these sectors. And we had a program, Startup Delta in the Netherlands, very flat country, to support startups within these regions. And then the Russian deputy, I think, for innovation of the ministry asked us, but what about the funding? I said, yeah, that's a bit like venture, and that is... So I didn't have an answer. And then he said, yeah, but that is bad, that you don't have any strategy of funding these type of initiatives. And then last year, we had another meeting, and then they said, we want to present our new innovation strategy in Russia. And it consists of 4 pillars. And they were laughing. First pillar, 30 top sectors. Second pillar, wow, we're going to push a selected number of universities to become engaged in innovation and entrepreneurship. Third pillar, we support startups, Skolkovo, Innopolis, etc., etc. We import it. Fourth pillar. The fourth pillar is that we have, well, in my words, forced 30 large Russian companies that the startups in this process can choose one of these large firms to be their launching customer, and they cannot refuse. And they have to pay for it. Now, I can tell you, this will be difficult in the Netherlands. And then they were laughing. This is our main source of actually funding entrepreneurship. So they look at this and say, look, it's nice funding, universities, we can do this, but the best way of funding startups is to give them a large first customer. And that is why you can use challenges and things like that to create these types of settings. So a third element is that you need large firms, and that's a bit of a paradox, to make entrepreneurship successful because they are the customers, often in business-to-business entrepreneurship. The last thing, the last corner, is institutions. And in economic theory, you would have two types of institutions. You would have formal and informal institutions. Now, formal institutions means that you have rules and regulations that are supportive for startups and entrepreneurship. I give you one example that we have been working on in the Netherlands for 5 years and have failed to achieve so far. And you think this is a detail. But in the Netherlands, it is the case that if a firm goes bankrupt, the tax authorities have the first claim on the assets that are left. So if you go bankrupt and if there's anything left and you get somebody who's going to clear the company, the first you have to pay are the taxes. This is killing for entrepreneurship. Because suppose you do it differently, that the banks would have the first claim of everything that is left. Then the bank knows when giving a loan to the firm that at least if it fails, they get some of the money back. Whereas in the Netherlands, the bank gets back nothing because we first have to pay taxes. And the effect of that is that the bank will not finance startups in the first place. So this is an example where you have to look at regulations and how these regulations affect the behavior of people in the market. Not whether, and a mistake often, what we also see with the World Bank, is that they look too much to how many days does it take to set up a company. It is also how the law works out in favor or against companies. Another example, it's often said that in the US, people don't care too much when a firm goes bankrupt, when there's a mistake. Well, yes, that is because in their law, the banks cannot follow you for the rest of your life to repay your debt. They can in most European countries. That makes a lot of a difference whether you are allowed to start a second firm. That's about formal institutions. But probably equally important, or maybe even more important, is the informal institutions. And then we talk mostly about culture. So I also work a lot across Africa. And one of the main problems in African countries with respect to entrepreneurship is that families, especially families that are not that poor but have a bit of capital, if there are 7 children, then the oldest son can go to university or has a good level of education. And the family spends all the resources on putting that one person through education. That person should, for the family, earn a stable living for the extended family. Now, there are only two ways that you can earn an income like that. Either you go and work for the government, or you become a doctor. But becoming an entrepreneur for these people is a no-go because it's too uncertain for them. So they will get a lot of pressure from their family not to start a business because it's simply too uncertain. So that means that you lose in that culture nearly all people with the educational level to become effective entrepreneurs. So that is an example, and just one example, how embedded cultures can play an important role. But also think about, I want to say something about entrepreneurship. A big, of course, question that many people ask me is, can you actually make entrepreneurs? My answer always is, well, people can discover that they're more entrepreneurial than they are. But if you are, I see many students here as well, if you are 22, I cannot make you an entrepreneur anymore. So your personality is already set. So what I can do is, if you are, I can support you a bit better in a sense. But I cannot make a different personality, although people may not know their personality. But people sometimes ask, why are so many people in Israel successful entrepreneurs? And I have two explanations, not rival ones, but I think there are two things are important. The first obvious one is that entrepreneurship is teamwork. Teamwork is very much discipline in teams. So, if every man has to go to the army for 2 years and support a technology high state army, that kind of teamwork helps a lot with forming team-based entrepreneurial firms. If you ask for many Israeli startup entrepreneurial firms, many of these people know each other from the army. But that is not culture. Well, it has something to do with culture. The other culture is that if you have the bar mitzvah, then already people will start, your uncles, your parents, your grandfather, they put in money when you do the bar mitzvah, when you're 12, 13. You cannot spend that money until you're 18. But every birthday, they come to your birthday party and they ask you, what are you going to do with the money when you're 18? Every year you have to think about, how am I going to invest that money? Because they all expect you in that culture to do something with that financial investment in you. Well, why do you think that more people start a firm there? So these are, let's say, things that are related to religion and culture that can have a big influence as well. Okay, of course there's a lot to do with changing in generations also in Russia, where you have legacy effect from former systems, etc. I think that people would say in intercultural that we come from completely opposite cultures. Probably Russia is the most hierarchical, well-organized country in the world, whereas the Netherlands is the total chaos without any respect for your fellow people, let alone for people that are older than you. So we are probably at complete opposite ends of some part of the cultural spectrum. Of course, these kind of things matter. These kind of matter on what kind of entrepreneurial system you build. Okay, I move to the right. I move to the right because you can have a system and you can have ideas. But if you come like me from a business school, what is important also is that we every day, so Victor is sitting here, so we do all kinds of things. So I had a meeting with the deans also of the let's say the beta sciences this morning, and of course everybody thinks I have to do this and the other one has to do that, and you give a lot of autonomy to people to do what they think is right. But what is also important in a very large organization, like a university or a region, is that you cannot manage large organizations with operational rules and regulations. What people need is that they can coordinate their actions, their individual actions, based on a certain goal that we know where we're actually going. So we get all kinds of freedom to act as entrepreneurs, as deans, as students, as operators. But if we have no clue where we're actually going, it becomes a complete chaos. So on top of this, what is often needed is that you must have some kind of a clear goal, what you could call in business a clear strategy. And if we have a clear strategy and we know the strategy, then we can do what we want. Because at least we can coordinate our actions based on that strategy. So you must know, in a sense, like from a regional perspective, for example, that you have a plan and what do you actually want to achieve. And often that is not so obvious. It's not so obvious because a regional leader or a university leader has to say, look, we can do what we want, but that is what we ultimately want to achieve. For example, if you look at the regional economy, do you think economic growth is important? Do you think diversification of your industry is important? Do you think that it's not growth per se that's important, but employment of people is important? These are very different things. So if you have no clue what you're actually trying to achieve with supporting entrepreneurship, then people start running around in opposite directions. So often it is very important, although it may sound top-down, that all these kinds of initiatives of entrepreneurial organizations are supported with a strong leadership vision on where you would actually end up. And that is, I think, very much a key to success. So you have the basics, you have a clear strategy, and you have a system in between with what you coordinate. These are, however, the ingredients. And I think that a lot of people think that if you have the ingredients, it will work, but it will not. Because you need ingredients, but you also have to have a system to make this work together. Or how does this work in practice? And that's a bit my next slide. So this is, let's say, more the clear slide. But now it becomes really vague, like in the business school. How would you do this recipe and managerial-wide? What is important to stimulate? So these components we have talked about. Basically, we have this research that you need talent and ideas. You need basic research in the sense that you need breakthrough technologies, etc., in search for good things. You need innovation and applied science. You need the ecosystem. You need a clear strategy. So we've talked about that. So I leave that corner a bit here. What is important is that you actively play a role, and there really university can help. And let me put it more bluntly. So often if you read books about entrepreneurial ecosystem, they will tell you entrepreneurs should run the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Because that is the only way to make this credible. The problem is often entrepreneurs will not do that. They are actually busy with making money for their own company. They are not willing to pay a lot of time to building up something like a regional ecosystem. So a university often steps in, not as a leader, but as a facilitator for creating the network for people to connect in that system. And then the question is, what should you connect? So one of the most influential, I think, theories in, let's say, networks and also social science per se, is Granovetter's, now a bit of theory, of weak ties. So basically, for the people who are not schooled in sociology, Granovetter did a big study in the 1980s of which people quickly found a new job and which people did not find quickly a new job when they got unemployed. And it turned out that people who had no friends quickly found a job. And especially the people who had good friends, who answered, did not find quickly a new job. And the reason was this, is that people who don't have a few good friends spend all that time with a few good friends that they know very well. Whereas people who have no friends have many more people that they actually know vaguely. And it turns out that these opportunities come from these vague contexts, not from the people that you already know. So that was the reason. So the thing is, if you think about networks, it may be a strategy not to have a few very good relations with the very good firms and invest a lot in a few relations. Maybe you should focus on having many very loose relations and creating connections between those relations, because that creates far more opportunities than only these few good relations. We are often approached, also in Utrecht, where we have an incubator, with one firm that actually wants to buy our incubator. They say, well, you have funding problems, we fund your incubator. But as soon as we have one or two big sponsors, we lose out of the network effects of loose contacts. And we know ultimately that our students will not be happy. So invite many people. Have many not so good friends, but create parties with lots of people. And that is a way to organize more of the network. Be sure that you have a full engine. That think, okay, which parts of our system are not working? You can have banks, but maybe you miss these launching customers, etc., etc. So you should look how things connect. So this morning I had a talk with Gazprom Bank, and well, you as an economist, you're always a bit skeptical when you talk to banks. And we were talking about these launching customers, and they were talking about Transneft, etc. And I thought, are these the most interesting companies for startups? But then this manager told me, yes, but a lot of these startups get in contact with other launching customers through electricity companies, because they have other customers. So this kind of things is that you have to know what the lines are for these connections and what the holes are in these connections. Okay. I think that organized serendipity means that, this goes against many people's feeling, but if you work in business, then you know the effect that the best ideas come from encounters at the coffee machine. And So they don't come from sessions where people sit together for innovation. They come from a talk with a coffee machine. And often it means that innovative ideas come from what you would call coincidence. Now, of course, this is not easy to manage, coincidence. But you can think about how you create situations where these type of coincidences occur. So I run for another university a program some years ago, and that program, well, that ended not fantastic. And then a few years later, I asked people what they missed most about this program, what they thought was most effective. And they said, we missed the lunches. In the beginning of the program, we used to organize a lunch every month for the research support people in the university. These people didn't know each other. But after 2 or 3 months, the whole university support staff knew each other through these lunches. And out of that came a lot of ideas. We hadn't planned that. The idea was that simply because they met over lunch, these ideas come. Of course, now I know. And now my first, of course, advice always to these kind of programs, organize network lunches. It sounds like a waste of money, but this is organizing this type of luck, chance, and innovation and projects. Organized serendipity. Then, the other thing is people. And there are, I would say, 2 types of people that you have to know in such a system. Some people is what I would call boundary spanners. So you have people who work in a department, but you have also people who go across departments, or know departments at the administration, who can include industry. So it's maybe more important if you talk about we want to have our industrial partners. It's more in an organization, a large organization like a university, you have to know the names of the people that connect. It's nice to write it down, we should connect, but you should have really names about people who span the boundaries between parties. So a central organization must have a list of 50 names of people in their organization that you have to have more than one thing. And often you know if you think about it. And if you want to have a successful ecosystem or a successful way of this strategy, you have to know these people and you have to invite them in the system that you are creating. So it's not everybody, but especially in the first stage, these people who already do more than one thing, that should be involved. Closely connected is what you could call oilmen. And this is not the oilmen, people from oil, but these are people who oil machines. Some people, and there are not that many, always feel a responsibility to run around all kinds of organizations and look how they can oil these kind of connections. Who know people, who can say a good word, who connect, etc. And so it's not that these people are in the organization spanning new things, but they actually already play a role of knowing everybody. You and your friends, you all have somebody in your friends of who you know that he or she knows everything. She's talking to everybody, she knows all the last rumors, etc. So if you want to know something, and this is also the person that if you have problems with, you say, well, can you not talk to this or that person and say something? Every university, if you think about it, has maybe 10 people that we all know are oil men and oil women. For any of these kinds of initiative, it's very important to know who these people are and involve these type of people. So you must have, in these systems, in a firm, you must have a hit list of people that you are going to approach. And then the last thing, very, let's say, famous comment from Brad Feld, you have to know whether you are a leader or a feeder. You have to know your role as giving guidance or facilitating these type of exchange. And that is important that you know who are the effective leaders of such a process and who play a very important role in feeding actively this type of process. Okay, so this is a bit of a recipe. We need the people, identify the people, and we have to identify the important processes of how these connections, how actually the ingredients work together. And obviously, a lot is borrowed from organization theory. Okay, so let me move a bit to, well, what I see in the first 2 or 3 years, and of course, this is very short, but what I think from your perspective, could be important opportunities, I think, for entrepreneurship at TSU. Well, I think that if you think about leadership and about this type of strategic guidance, here it is in Russia, I think, in general, but it's very strong in the sense that lots of people have a clear idea why they are actually doing this. And especially also in a region like Tomsk, we all know that the traditional industry here is ending in a sense. And that the economy needs to be diversified towards different type of economic activities. So you are basically quite blessed, I would say, as an opportunity. You're quite blessed because it's so obvious economically which direction you have to go. In the Netherlands, this is far less obvious. Everybody is discussing actually what the direction or why we are actually doing this. So here, the big advantage in this region is that you have a clear purpose. You know you have to do something completely different to earn money today in 20 years than you do today. So there's an urgency. I think that's a big advantage in these type of discussions. So the second thing is that, yes, the economy might be dominated by a few large firms, and it is very nice to teach people accounting. It is very nice to teach people sales if you have already a product. But we already know that the big companies where the graduates will go, well, that will not be the majority of the future of work. We already see that the large rise in employment, also in the Netherlands, by the way, comes from the SME and entrepreneurial firms. So lots of people work in a completely different environment. Now I can tell you, and probably also people who have companies, that bookkeeping is something completely different in a firm with 10 employees than it is with 100,000 employees. And we teach in university the tools as if all our graduates are going to work in firms with 100,000 employees. So these kind of things that we already know that the future of work is in different type of organizations where people have to be entrepreneurial, have to have different sets of skills, have to do business development instead of marketing, etc. They have to do research about customer preferences instead of sales. These kind of things are already quickly changing. But they have not changed enough, I think, in what we're doing in university. And this is a, let's say, common kind of thing. So a lot of work will be in technology, I would say, type of SMEs in the future that need different skills. The third thing, and that is, I think, very interesting in Tomsk, is that Tomsk is a very nice city. So, and if you look at the leading urbanization theories, then Richard Florida's theory about the creative class, his advice is this. And you can see it if people go to Berlin. So, I'm going to ask who's gone to Berlin lately. But 5 years ago, Berlin was a complete mess. Complete mess as a city. And now things are changing in Berlin. And the idea was, the advice of probably one of the most influential thinkers in this type of environment was that you first make a nice city. You first have theater, you first have movies, you first have a lot of bars. And if you have that, then the right people will come. And if the right people are there, they will find each other and they will start good businesses. But people, the creative, good people will not come to bad cities. Now, if you look at Novosibirsk, if you look at, let's say, a few other cities, these are not nice cities. So ultimately, you may still be a bit too creative, but in the end, the whole of Siberia would want to migrate to Tomsk. Not because there is work in Tomsk, but because there are good bars in Tomsk. So, and to say, this is of course, for men, young men are only interested in one thing. Why do they go to the city? To find nice young women in these bars. They don't come to a city to start a company or to become rich. So, I think that if you look at Tomsk, it is much better placed than many other cities to become this kind of a creative hub. But out of that, you will see that the large companies are built. So they go to Seattle, they go to California, etc., because it's nice there. That's why it starts. Sun every day, nice city, San Francisco. San Francisco, very liberal climate. I can tell you, Amsterdam is booming. So now of course, this is a bit, can I say also disruptive things? Yes? Can I say disruptive things? Okay, so I'm from the Netherlands. I'm close to Amsterdam. Actually, I studied in Amsterdam. Amsterdam is one of the main, let's say, entrepreneurial hotspots today. You know why? Well, that's because Amsterdam is Sodom and Gomorrah. We have lots of drugs, lots of drinks, nice things in a sense. But the Netherlands, and now it's a bit more serious, has in Amsterdam, you should not underestimate the fact that a substantial proportion of talented people is homosexual. Not more than others, but simply a substantial amount of people in the world are homosexual. Amsterdam is the most liberal place in the world for that. So a lot of entrepreneurial homosexual people like to be in Amsterdam, and it is booming with creative people. So sometimes this kind of liberal type of attitude that you have as a city can attract simply the right creative people. So this is this type of cultural things that can be quite important. Now you have a big hinterland where people can come from. Very important. And I think also a last thing about funding is that you have many old and dying industries with a lot of cash which have to do something. That have to diversify, have to get talent in, do different things, but they have pots of cash coming from oil and to a lesser extent gas. So I would say that Tomsk has got the greatest mix to be the next Silicon Valley out of this. So, what should a Center for Entrepreneurship do? I'm overrunning my time, I think, big time. So I hope you still like it. Say yes. Yes, thank you. Okay. So a bit more about Centers for Entrepreneurship, because of course I'm here also to advise a bit on how to set this up. And I think that there are basically 3 types of settings that you can think of, and of course you can combine them. But I think combining these type of visions of entrepreneurship also within universities is not so easy. So you can have what you could call some kind of a minimalist vision of a Center for Entrepreneurship, where you would say, look, we simply want to have entrepreneurship courses in the curriculum. So who should organize these courses, and who should be let's say the quality assurance, train the trainer programs? How would you actually do that? So now I've also talked to a few of the universities. Of course, the problem is here there are already too many general courses in the bachelor. Why introduce another one? Should we not change it for something that we already have? Should we train disciplinary people into entrepreneurship, or should we only do this in the... So this is minimalist in the sense that it is simply about education only. It is not minimalist in the sense that you have nothing to do, in a sense. So you must still organize these kind of things. The second, what I would call the mezzanine in-between type of function, is that a lot of people will tell you, and I'm one of them, that if you focus on entrepreneurship education and students have no idea what they can do with that education, they will not follow it. And they will not appreciate it. So if you have no connected incubators, no protection of their intellectual property or rules for it, etc., and you don't support alumni for the first 5 or 6 years who do startups, students have no idea what they would actually can achieve with entrepreneurship education. So many universities will say, look, we have to combine this type of entrepreneurship education with what students then can actually do with it. So then the Centers for Entrepreneurship often become some kind of an umbrella. It can be a new center, or it can be a program, or it can have divisions. There are many things, but at least they try to make visible across universities, on top of entrepreneurship education, what students can actually do in the university environment with entrepreneurship. So with incubation, with technology transfer, etc., and you, as let's say, of umbrella type of function, how you would call that a Center for Entrepreneurship. The big problem, and that is more the grandiose version. So in the Netherlands, we had a strange discussion, I think 10 years ago when we started this type of... so there was the ministries who were supporting a lot of entrepreneurship and also incubation. And the discussion was this. We, as universities, were thinking, okay, we want to have these kind of structures for our students. Whereas the Ministry of Education said, no, we want to connect existing companies to university knowledge. So we were always thinking, and that's not very entrepreneurial, it's like inside out, from university to society. We have knowledge, we have students, how do we push it in? But you shouldn't underestimate the fact that there are many firms out there and many people who want to enter university, who want to discuss what kind of research they want from university, what kind of projects they want to bring in. So instead of only looking at organizing the inside out, an even bigger vision is that you become, with the Center for the landing place for it. And I think and that's probably also here, is that if you talk to companies, they often find it very difficult to find the right people, persons, etc. within university. And it can help that you at least have some kind of central visibility of where firms can go where their people can go if they want to approach a university. And the most successful, I think, entrepreneurial universities, Oxford in Europe at least, Oxford, Leuven, they have organized this in a quite ambitious way as a lending platform. It's not about that, but it's, and it's a grandiose way you combine education, what people can do with education, with a landing spot, and you have it all in one place. So you create your own ecosystem. Okay, clearly you can see this as a growth strategy, where you start with the first, move to the second, and then the third. However, in practice, any businessman will tell you that it's not so easy. Because as soon as you say, well, the Center for Entrepreneurship is about education, it's difficult to grow up with that. So it's important to think in what kind of setting you start such a center. Okay. To wrap this up, I think that if you want to do a bit of a check on building these kind of things up, is that you have to know what specific knowledge you actually have. So what are your strengths? And I think it's nice here that you try to combine strength in things like smart materials, where you let strategic challenges and technical challenges in a multidisciplinary way drive this kind of steering. So that the knowledge is not that disciplinary, but it's a combination. But still you have to be quite clear what your focus is. And that's problematic for many universities to make choices in that. Where does finance come from? Who are the launching firms that you should have as part of your board? And what kind of informal institutions are actually blocking these kind of conservatism, etc., within your organization? What are structurals? What are you missing? Is an important question. Who in the organization are these boundary sparrows and oilmen? Who should be involved in this system? How would we deal, and it's also important to note, I've not touched upon it, I think that many of the discussions are about science and technology. But many students, often the majority of students, maybe not here, but in many large universities, are in social sciences. And the word entrepreneurship doesn't ring a big bell to them. But as soon as you start talking about social challenges and how they actively should solve social problems, which is basically the same as what entrepreneurs do, they become very enthusiastic about it. So how do you connect these type of initiatives to social elements to gear up this kind of processes? So you engage much more students in a process, much more university-wide, if you open up to the societal challenges instead of only look at inside-out ideas generation in entrepreneurship. Okay, and then of course these oil men, exactly who should be part. This is my talk. So now I open, of course, also to you. You probably have questions, suggestions also, of course. This is provocative. Yeah, I see that there's already a question. I always welcome the first question, thank you. But I have to organize myself here. Or you ask it in English, I guess. Yes, okay. But, yeah, okay.
Very much, Hein, for an interesting lecture. Generous compliments to our talks.
Yeah.
Including examples. Personally, I love the one about the African people who are afraid even to think about being entrepreneurs. To me, to compare with the Chinese people, because I've lived in China for a few years. Those people are born with the idea that they are made to be entrepreneurs. And getting back to Russia, as you mentioned, that we definitely have some difficulties, like such as lack of entrepreneurial skills and probably holes in
Maybe.
the structure,
Yeah.
and clearly lack of clear
Okay. This is very loud, I think. I first want to tell you a story about China. Let me see whether I can put this somewhere else. I do teach in China sometimes, entrepreneurship. And a few years ago, I was teaching a course for 30 students. 15 of them were Dutch, and 15 were Chinese. And we were talking about this type of cultural things. And then I said to the Dutch, so they were not mixing enough. So the Dutch were sitting there, the Chinese were sitting there, so it was and exactly what you're saying was true. And then I said to the Dutch part, you have to understand one thing. All your Chinese colleagues there, they are all very unhappy. And so everybody said, no, you cannot say that they're unhappy. And of course the Chinese, they were thinking, okay, what does he mean? And so they said, so one of the Dutch asked, is it right, are you unhappy? And then they answered, yes, we are very unhappy. And then of course there was panic in the group. And then I said, I have to know one thing about the culture in China. Yes, they all want to be entrepreneur, but for the wrong reason. And because if you are a child in China and you come home and you have the highest grades of your class, there is always a nephew that is better than you. And your mother will tell you the whole week that there is something better than you. I see people here. Your whole life as a kid in China, there is somebody better, and your parents, everybody will tell you that you are useless. Now, I can tell you, there are 1.4 billion Chinese. Jack Ma is the greatest entrepreneur in the world. Because if you come out of a system where from this age you're told you are useless, and you come out of that, you are the best fighter in the world. And you may not see the 900 million very unhappy Chinese that do not make it. And don't underestimate the fact that China is a horrible country. Second story about China. Because it's important cultural thing. Because if your second part is what do you see as the biggest problem, maybe it has to relate to this kind of things. As I said, I worked a lot in Africa. In Africa, a lot of Chinese stay. They come with large Chinese companies to extract natural resources, but many do not return. They have great entrepreneurial skills, but they stay as small SMEs all the time. You see many Chinese restaurants across the world. You know why? Because China is a horrible country for entrepreneurs. It is dominated by kleptocratic bureaucrats, large multinationals. If you are a small-scale entrepreneur, the least country where you are likely to succeed is China. Because you need all kinds of connections high up to succeed. It has 84 billionaires in the parliament. All children from rich communist party members 1 generation ago. Never tell me that all Chinese are entrepreneurial and China is an entrepreneurial city, of a country. So that is, and it's important, these kind of cultural things. I think, and we are also discussing this in the university context, your biggest threat as Tomsk is that you are in this location. So it is difficult to get here. People might come from the neighborhood, but your connections with the rest of the world will not be easy. Because the connections that you can build if you want to build up an international audience of students here to mix and to create these connections, not that many people will be interested. And I think that if I'm honest, the biggest challenge, that of course IT can help you, the borderless world can help you, it will help you a lot. In relative terms it's good for them, but still, if you think about connections, and many of these looser connections, then Tomsk has its weakness. Also work in Kazan, you see it is closer, and it matters. There are direct flights coming, etc. So that is still, I think, a difficult thing. And so you have the unique element that you have so many skilled people here because of the historical heritage. There is a reason why things are where they are, but I think if you ask me what is the thing to worry, that's the thing to worry. And I think I congratulate also the university that they really actually try to change this, but I must honestly say this is pretty heroic to change this. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
But there is another opinion that it could be an opportunity as well, because in Russia, like cities near the Golden Ring, and they say that your advantage is that the young people stay. And in our location, most of the young people go to Moscow. They do not want to develop their cities. So maybe on the one hand, it's a problem. On the other hand, it's another opportunity.
True. I think,
Thank you very much.
yeah, I think about that point, that if you look at theory, so where a lot of entrepreneurship theory is going and urbanization, is exactly what you're pointing out, is that, yes, we know it has been a success in large metropoles, in California, in New York, in London, in Paris, in Berlin. But the challenge is to have what you would call second-tier cities, like Tomsk or Utrecht, where I'm from, to make them also entrepreneurial, because then you probably have the best of both worlds. They don't have the bad things about it. I was having dinner with Konstantin yesterday, and he exactly pointed that out. That is, so he lives in Moscow as well. So yeah, okay, there comes a point where Tomsk has got the good things enough so that people stay here or come here, especially the people that you want to keep. And there's lots of reason to think that the most entrepreneurial city will be actually not the largest city, which also have the bad things, but also the nicely evolving cultural cities. But still, you're used to the climate, but I'm not, you know? And I think the world majority of the people is not. And these kind of things do matter. Yeah. More questions? Let me just. Yes? Okay. You ask in English? I think one of the main advantages is also, I'm just telling this way. I think that the main advantage of Tomsk, of TSU, probably compared to the other universities in, I'm just get this. So what I think is in your university, and also then compared to other how can I get this off? Let me just, yeah, now it's off. Is that you are a very broad university. If you are a specialized university, often your steps can be quicker in the beginning, but the result of impact is smaller. And I think that's one. The other thing is you have a very famous McKinsey approach to innovation, which is called the 70-20-10 approach. It's the basic framework for innovation of McKinsey. The framework says that in companies, 70% of what they do is what you could call incremental innovation. 20% in your portfolio is what you would call more on the frontier, and 10% of the budget is spent on really over-the-top type of innovation. I think that if you only have applied research and innovation, you only do incremental types of innovation in a specific field. I think that what is important, if you have a deep base of fundamental science like you have, plus you have innovation initiatives, you have to do a bit more about behavioral component of entrepreneurship, then you are able to work across the whole spectrum of innovation. Disruptive, incremental, and also a bit on the frontier. And I think that if you are smaller or too applied, you cannot have a full offering of innovation. And I think for companies, this is, so stop. I can tell you something about, from the Netherlands, why we have actually moved to engaging universities in innovation. It was the year 2008. And if you listen to the word 2008, maybe not for you in Russia, but 2008 was the year of the economic crisis. And the head of the Employers Federation, voted 5 times the most powerful man in the Netherlands, is Bernard Wientjes. And he became later, when he retired, the executive chair of my Center for Entrepreneurship in Utrecht. And he told me what happened. Really told me what happened. 4 weeks, 1 month after the hit of the financial crisis, there was a meeting at ASML, the chip maker, of the 20 most influential CEOs of the Netherlands. And their opinion was, after the financial crisis, the first thing that will go in the Netherlands is innovation. We will kill, because of the financial crisis, all our innovation, our R&D departments. What we want to do is to shift all innovation to universities. That is why, and you have to finance it as a government. And that is actually the reason why we moved so aggressively towards this. Now, I think that if you ask me for the biggest strength that you have, is that you would be the ideal partner to work together because you have the full spectrum. And I think that is important. However, you need to add, I would say, with entrepreneurship, a bit of the behavioral component of staff, students, to make this work. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Yeah, and I hope to see some of you in the coming weeks.